It started like any other segment on live television, calm, controlled, and completely predictable. The hosts were mid-conversation, casually moving through their topic, the kind of discussion audiences had seen 100 times before. Nothing felt out of place. Not yet. Matthew McConaughey sat there relaxed, listening more than speaking. He nodded along, occasionally smiling, giving just enough reaction to stay engaged without taking over the conversation. At first glance, it looked like he was simply another guest going through the motions. But then something shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, if you blinked, you might have missed it entirely. One of the hosts leaned forward slightly, her tone changing just enough to signal that the conversation was about to take a different direction. A simple question followed, but the way it was asked carried weight. Matthew paused. Not a long pause, but just long enough to feel unusual on live TV. And that's when everything began to change. He responded calmly, choosing his words carefully, but there was something about his tone that didn't quite match the rhythm of the show. It wasn't confrontational, it wasn't aggressive, but it was firm, unexpectedly firm. One of the hosts gave a quick smile, the kind people use when they're not entirely sure how to react. Another shifted in her seat, her expression tightening for just a second before she quickly masked it. The conversation didn't stop, but it definitely slowed down. You could feel it. That subtle tension that creeps in when something unscripted starts to unfold. Matthew continued speaking, and the more he explained, the clearer it became that this wasn't going to be a typical back and forth. He wasn't backing down, but he also wasn't escalating. Instead, he stayed composed, almost too composed. And sometimes, that's what makes things more intense. Because when someone remains completely calm in a moment that feels slightly off, it forces everyone else to adjust. And not everyone adjusts the same way. Another host jumped in, trying to redirect the conversation, but the timing fell off. The transition didn't land the way it was supposed to. For a split second, two people spoke at once, then stopped. And that's when it happened. Silence. Not the planned kind. Not the kind used for dramatic effect. This was different. This was the kind of silence that lingers just a little too long, the kind that makes people home leaning closer to their screens. The audience didn't react immediately. No laughter, no applause, just a brief moment of stillness, as if everyone was waiting to see who would speak next and what they would say. Matthew didn't rush to fill the gap. He just sat there, watching, listening, completely at ease, which somehow made the moment even more uncomfortable. One of the hosts finally broke the silence, but her voice carried a different energy now, slightly cautious, slightly measured, as if she was choosing her words more carefully than before. And from that point on, nothing felt the same. The conversation tried to move forward, but the shift had already happened. You could hear it in the pauses, see it in the expressions, feel it in the pacing. What was supposed to be a smooth, flowing discussion had turned into something much more unpredictable. Matthew stayed consistent, calm, steady, almost unbothered. He didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice, didn't push harder than necessary, but he also didn't pull back. And that balance created a kind of tension that's hard to ignore. One of the hosts attempted to lighten the mood, adding a quick comment that might have worked earlier in the segment, but now it landed differently. The timing was off, and instead of easing the tension, it made the contrast even more noticeable. Another brief pause followed, shorter this time, but just as telling. The audience began to respond again, but it wasn't the same energy as before. There was hesitation now, a sense that everyone was aware something unusual had just happened, even if they couldn't fully explain it. Matthew leaned back slightly, still composed, still controlled. If anything, he seemed more comfortable the more uncertain the room became. And that's what made this moment stand out. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, no obvious confrontation. But sometimes the quietest moments are the ones people remember the most, because they feel real. The hosts eventually managed to steer the conversation toward a safer direction, transitioning into the next topic with a kind of urgency that didn't go unnoticed. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift away from whatever had just happened. But by then, it didn't matter. The moment had already been created. Clips would be replayed. Reactions would be shared. And people watching would come to their own conclusions, trying to figure out exactly what they had just seen. Was it awkward? Was it misunderstood? Or was it simply one of those rare live TV moments where everything doesn't go exactly as planned? Whatever the answer is, one thing is certain. Moments like this don't need to be loud to leave an impact. And sometimes, the silence says more than anything else ever could. If you enjoy breaking down these real, unscripted talk show moments, make sure you subscribe to Fame After Hours, because this is where we uncover what really happens when the cameras are rolling. And tell me in the comments, did this moment feel awkward to you, or do you think it's being overanalyzed?